We're going to continue on in this series of questions that we've been looking at in the I was going to say in the New Testament. We've actually touched on the Old Testament as well, but questions that have been posed by believers, disciples, seekers, questions posed by Christ himself, and we're going to see if we can find some insight through some questions asked in John chapter 11. It's already 11:25, but that's good. The praise team got us to the sermon portion in good time, but just to warn you, we have to get through the message. The message touches on some subjects that are probably difficult for a lot of us, frankly. And then we have communion together towards the end of the service, and we have to wrap it up before the Sunday school teachers start going nuts because we've run this service too long. Okay, so we're going to, as you heard from what the passage that Cindy read, we're going to look at that section in John 11, the story of Lazarus, the story of Lazarus dying and then rising from the dead at the call of Christ, and what that potentially is all about. Radar. Radar, we'll leave that till later. And chart plotters and radar, we'll leave that till later too. So John 11:1 says, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. A couple of things just to point out in this passage that are interesting and that we miss when we read it in English. They send this message to Jesus saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. The Greek would more directly translate to English by saying, Lord, that friend you're fond of is sick. Okay, what we get to in the last sentence there on the slide, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. That's actually the agape word. So the first one is a friendship love. The second one, the writer of the gospel is affirming as he writes that the love of Christ for this family went far beyond the love of friends. It was that divine, unstoppable love that he, in fact, had for these people. Reassuring when you see what happens next. As we continue on in the story, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now remember that, 2 more days. Okay? Then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Now, the main point I want you to get out of this section is the 2 more days. The passage, the section near the end there about 12 hours of daylight, I have looked this up over the years in probably a dozen different commentaries and writers, and there's more confusion over that passage than you wouldn't believe. So there's different theories on what he meant. To some extent, it almost feels like he's just changing the subject, doesn't it? They're saying like, hey, didn't they try to kill you there? Why are we going back there? He seems to just sort of change the subject and sort of seems to imply that, well, as long as we're walking in the will of God, then whatever happens is okay. Maybe seems to be what he's saying, but it feels like he's almost just changing the subject. But the point I want you to pick up from this section, as I say, is that he hears the news that Lazarus is sick, and he stays there 2 more days. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. But for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. So, interesting here as he explains to them that Lazarus has died. Now, we were talking about this at home the other day, and Linda mentioned something I'd kind of forgotten, that when my mother passed away, and we'd known that she was in the process of passing away, and we'd been sort of taking turns visiting, and my sister was staying at her bedside, and anyway, she finally slipped away. But I knew that many people at Bethel had been praying for her and for our family, so I sent out an email to the church saying that my mother had arrived safely home. Apparently, many here in the church assumed that she'd been traveling or vacationing somewhere, and she'd made it safely back home. And so we sometimes speak in riddles, don't we? Sometimes when we speak about these things, but as believers, and this is what Jesus is affirming here, is that death for the believer is not death as we sometimes refer to it in another sense. It is a passing from this life into glory, and it's just different. It's a journey home. And so he just refers to it as sleep. And I suppose if you have the power to go and shake a dead person by the shoulder and bring them back to life again, then we may refer to it as just sleep as well. I mean, he seems to wake Lazarus more easily in this story than we used to wake our teenagers. So I can understand why he would refer to it as simply sleep. But so he says, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad he was not there, so that you may believe. Let us go to him. Thomas, you got to love Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas. Here he seems very committed, actually, but almost fatalistic, doesn't he? He's kind of like, oh, well, boys, this is it. This is the end of the story. Let's go with him, and we're all going to die together. So on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, again, think of the timing here. So Jesus gets the message that Lazarus is sick. He waits 2 more days, and then he travels. Well, the place he was traveling from to get to Bethany was probably about 1 day's journey. So it's actually quite likely that by the time he got the news, Lazarus had already passed away. But, we don't know for sure, but it would seem based on the place and the time it would typically take to travel that Lazarus had actually died before Jesus even got the message. But now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Mary heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Tough statement, isn't it? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. As I read that, I thought, what is she saying here? Is she accusing him? Or did she know the same math that I just mentioned, that probably, in fact, Lazarus had already died by the time he got the news? At the same time, she knew that Jesus seemed to know things sometimes that were hard to explain. So she would kind of have to assume that he actually had known that Lazarus was sick. So she makes this statement or asks this question or hurls this accusation. I'm not sure which. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And, as I pondered that, and it's such a difficult thing to ponder, isn't it? When I think of different things at Bethel over the years, I think of Toby Bracewell. And I think when she passed away, we all kind of felt like, Lord, what happened if you'd been here? And when we lost James Wilson, if you'd been here? So it's a tough question, isn't it? We all ask the question. Recently, Dr. Kimoff, we asked, what happened? You allowed that, Lord? What were you doing? And so we reach times in our lives where we sort of say, What were you doing, Lord? We don't get it. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. So they have this whole conversation here that feels very deep, and yet Martha, is still kind of wrestling with this, right? She's having this sort of theological conversation about this future thing, this resurrection and the life out there in the future, and that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and there's a future day when he's going to rise again. And she's kind of saying, yeah, but like right now, I got a problem. My brother just died. And there's this difficult thing here. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, we've heard this again, haven't we? Before, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I think these sisters had been having a conversation, and they'd been saying, what happened? Like, he's our friend, and he just didn't show up in our hour of need. I think we've all had friends like that just didn't seem to show up when we needed them the most. And so they're asking this question. And so we sometimes find ourselves, don't we, in the presence of God, saying, where were you when I needed you most? And it's a tough question. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And so I find it incredibly insightful here that Jesus never answers the implied question. The implied question, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you, Lord? What happened? How did you let this happen? He never answers the question. And as I've pondered that, and I've pondered this question my whole life. As many of you know sort of my story, when my father passed away when I was 14, and it was very sudden. And I wrestled with that at that time, and I've wrestled with it over the years. Where are you, Lord, in those moments? What's going on? And I've sometimes thought, I kind of get it why he didn't try to answer the question. How do you explain to time-bound mortals that there's this bigger picture, that there is this immense picture that precedes the time, precedes the whole concept of time, and extends out past the whole concept of time? And we're in this little time-bound moment. And Jesus, the eternal one, the one who was in the beginning, the one who was before the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That one that goes all the way back to before time began, to the beginning. That one, trying to explain to a couple of grieving mortals how this all works. If you've ever stood beside a fishbowl and tried to explain to a goldfish the bigger world out there, okay? You can imagine the difficulty of Christ trying to explain to us little time-bound mortals what the bigger picture and what this is all about. And so he doesn't explain, but he does do something very, very special, Very, very special. And I think I just put a couple other passages in here so that we can remember when we see in here this statement, Jesus wept, and the Jews saying, see how he loved him. Somehow the King James sounded better there, didn't it? Behold how he loved him. And so when we see that, it's good for us to remember that in fact the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. So when we see Jesus weeping there, it's not that sort of Jesus is this soft, squishy, emotional version of stern God. No, he is the exact representation of his being. And so when we grieve in our moments of grief, when we have tears streaming down and we have that huge, massive lump in our throat that just won't go away, yeah, God grieves with us. And so it's important to understand that. No one has ever seen God, John says in John 1:18. But the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. In John 14, Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? And so that man weeping by the grave of Lazarus is actually showing us the Father. Okay? And so when you weep, the Father's there with you, grieving, comforting, sustaining. But there's more to this story. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Now, we don't know much about this particular tomb, but we know in that area, most of the tombs actually had space for 8 bodies, okay? 3 on each side and 2 on the end. And they would sort of stagger their use of them. So by the time you opened it again to put another one in there, you'd left enough time for the previous one in there. So they opened this stone. There may have been multiple bodies in there. Took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And so I think it was St. Augustine who first said, actually, he might have, we only remember the guys that wrote it down, right? So for all we know, St. Augustine heard it from someone else, but he wrote it down so he gets the credit. Pointed out that if he hadn't said Lazarus, that the whole graveyard would have emptied out, okay? And so he says, Lazarus, come out. And this man who's been dead for 4 days rises and comes out. And Jesus says, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And so a funeral, a time period of mourning, this 7 days of mourning that was so ritualistic, turns into a resurrection party. I doubt they even had the right equipment for a resurrection party. That hadn't been in the plans in Bethany. And so, now, just one additional thing I want to point out here is the very next passage, right after this resurrection of Lazarus, we find the leadership in Israel, Jewish leadership in Israel, now plotting to kill Jesus. We also find, by the way, that at one point they're plotting to kill Lazarus. There are writers over the years that have tried to claim that the story of the resurrection of Lazarus was actually just a parable. Okay, well, it's kind of interesting because the Jews were walking around trying to come up with a plan to kill a parable. So there's no question this was the physical resurrection of someone who had died, and it begins the process of setting in motion the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And so Jesus, even as he calls Lazarus to life, he knows exactly what's coming next. And so many of the Jews that had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many signs." So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. And so this is the beginning of the path towards the cross. And so the death and the resurrection of Lazarus, in effect, sets in motion the death and resurrection of Christ, which was in itself necessary for the resurrection of Lazarus, right? Christ's power to give us resurrection life stems from the sacrifice that he made on the cross of Calvary. And so his death was necessary for my resurrection. It's just a great story. But back to radar. I want to talk about this for a minute because I feel like what we're seeing in the story of Lazarus, and we've got another example we're going to look at very briefly, is something that I've struggled to sort of think through myself, and I'm just going to tell you some of the things that have kind of helped me to think about this. So Sharon and I and the kids for many years have gone boating. And when you're out in your boat and you're traveling long distances, you have radar at the helm. And the radar is beaming radar way out ahead. But radar doesn't tell you that much, actually. It kind of tells you where there's anything that it's bouncing back, that the beam is bouncing off of. And so you can think there's a big rock over there, and it turns out later to be a flock of birds. So it can be confusing. But sometimes you see something like you see here. So in this particular scene of the radar, this is a scene where the boat is traveling through a long, narrow passageway. And up ahead, the passageway just seems to be completely blocked. You see that block right across. And you end up sort of saying, wait a second, what's that? And it always seems almost inevitable for Sharon and I that it's when I've stepped away from the helm and Sharon's taken over the helm. It's right at that point that something like this shows up on the radar, okay? And so we end up saying, what is that? It's blocked, okay? And then we check, and you notice in the top left, you have the range on the radar. Often we have ours set at 16 nautical miles or something. So we look and, well, it's, this blockage is 8 nautical miles away, and we're going 8 knots. So we actually have an hour to figure out whether or not we're going to hit something there. So we start doing some other looking. And then we check the chart plotter and overlay the radar on the chart plotter, and you realize, well, okay, this is the waterway, and the waterway still seems to be on the other side of that block. So what is that? And then usually now, of course, now we have access to Google, so we check Google, and we oh, there's a highway there. That must be the bridge, okay? And so suddenly we can see that there's something on the other side of that block. And so what do we do next? Well, we take these, and we start looking, and we aim, and we're like, oh, whoa. Oh, yeah, it's a bridge. And suddenly we have comfort and assurance that there is something on the other side of this block. And that changes everything, because now you know what's on the other side. And I remember as a kid standing at my father's grave with it, and a lot of people came to that. There was like 600 people standing there at that graveside. And as we sang together and went on that bright day we rise and sing the anthems, those anthems in the skies, in heavenly songs this note shall swell, our Jesus has done all things well. And as a kid that day, God gave me a set of binoculars. And it was a gift of a lifetime, because I have been able to go through my life, and I'd accepted Christ as a young child, but I do feel like it was that moment on that day that God said to me, here, take these binoculars. Look through here. Just look through here. Look, it's not a block. It's not the end of the road. There's something on the other side. And I'm going to take you there too. And so with that gift of binoculars, I have been able to go through life knowing that there is glory on the other side. And so what Jesus did for these disciples that day, what Jesus did for Martha and Mary that day, was he gave them a glimpse into the future. And he said, take a look at this. This is what the future's going to be. That's what he did. He loaned them a set of binoculars for one day. And he said, there's going to come a day when I will stand forth and call out the names of all who have accepted Christ, and they will rise. And you will see them again, and you will fellowship with them again. And right now, yes, you're stuck in this little world, and it feels like there's nothing beyond. But hey, take a peek through these binoculars, and you'll see there's life out there. There's glory on the other side. And so that, to me, what this was all about. And so one other example, and this was from, I know I got to watch my time here. This was from Luke 9. Jesus is talking about suffering coming soon. And just after he's warned the disciples that suffering is coming soon, what does he do? I'm going to move through this. He says, truly, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. About 8 days after this, Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. And so this was another example. I love this. This is another example where, the Lord just loaned his disciples a set of binoculars and said, hey, just take these. Where are those things? You got to picture them. He, in effect, said to his disciples, hey, take these. Put these on for a minute. And just look, that's the future, guys. That's the future. It's a future of glory. And Moses and Elijah, these ones that have passed away before. And we're going to all be together in glory. And so with that loaning of those binoculars, they get to see into the future. And later they write it down for us so that we can also get that glimpse of future glory. Okay? So there's a few places like this in Scripture where, in effect, we're given this future glimpse. Of course, we see more in Revelation. But I think the story of Martha and Mary and Lazarus is really special. And as I look around this room, I don't know a lot of you very well, but I see many faces here that have had some really tough years, and you've had some really tough years recently, and the pain is still quite fresh. And I would just say, ask God to loan you a set of binoculars, because he will give you a glimpse of the future. He will give you a glimpse of glory. And as you look ahead to glory, and you recognize that he can't always explain everything to us. When Martha and Mary said to Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died, he doesn't ever answer their implied question. He just gives them a glimpse of the future. Okay? And his plan for each and every one of us is future glory. Okay? And when they pulled away that stone and Lazarus heard that voice, he was able to respond and come forth. And I would just say to you this morning, if you have not yet responded to the voice of Christ, make sure you're not just hiding behind some stone and trying to avoid hearing his voice, because he wants to call to you. And he wants to wake you from spiritual death this morning and give you spiritual resurrection so that one day you too can join us and him in glory. And so it's just, I hope this warms your heart the way it warms mine. I know I've heard very deep and well thought out and well reasoned messages on why God allows suffering in the world. And this was not one of those, I recognize. This was just me meandering through this passage, sharing some of what God has given me to help me with some of life's challenges. And these binoculars, believe me, they're worth every penny. When God grants them to you, hang on to them. They'll help you through life.